This week, we're talking about what is romantasy, part 2, also known as Jordan's shower epiphany.
Weird. Hi, readers. I'm Jordan.
And I'm Katie.
And welcome to Not Another Heroine, Season 2, the podcast where we break down the best and worst fictional heroines of any genre. Because that's what we do now.
Want to see what's next on our TBR list? Subscribe to us on YouTube or follow us on Instagram for a sneak peek at upcoming content or to help us pick our next book. Jordan has cracked the code.
Maybe. We're taking a break from book reviews to talk about books in general, especially in our favorite genre.
Romantasy.
But romantasy isn't just romantasy.
No. Because Jordan has cracked it. There's nuances.
There are. And I feel like this is what speaks to different readers and then what appeals to like the masses.
Mm-hmm.
So there is romantasy.
Yeah.
And then
this is the outline.
Here we go.
Is the code, the Declaration of Independence. Here it is.
All right. Romantasy.
Yes.
Romantasy is 50-50 romance and world-building fantasy and plot.
Yes.
You cannot have one without the other. If you take away one, the book will be destroyed. There will be nothing left. Then there is romance with fantasy.
With fantasy. Just a little.
Maybe it's in a fun setting. And that is just entirely romance driven by the relationship development, but the background or the setting is fantastical or sci-fi or one of those things. And then we have fantasy with romance, which is a true, hero, heroine driven plot, lots of world building with just a smidgen of romance thrown in there to keep the readership going. 3 main categories.
My brain was broken by this statement. I hope our readers are equally as flabbergasted by the, coming down from the mountain with the commandments.
I'm carrying the tablet. Thou shalt read these.
I just love it because your veins are sticking out. You're like, romantasy.
If you want to access romantasy, you must start with both of these genres, these subgenres.
Absolutely. And I feel like, so we've talked so much about this that I feel like I don't even know what to tell our readers about this, but I think older readers started with fantasy with romance. And then as those readers got older and they maybe became authors themselves, they're like, I want a little bit more of this romance thing. And that gave birth to romantasy.
Yes.
Because romance with fantasy, I feel like has maybe always been a thing or has been kind of just a subgenre of the romance genre as a whole. But the fantasy with romance to romantasy was a curve, straight line,
one of those things.
Something. Weirdly enough, I took a lot of math classes, but I cannot tell a vector. I am at a loss.
Well, okay, so fantasy as a genre has been around. You think Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, all of these classic fantasy novels.
Yeah. Well, all of those have small romantic lines.
Yes, and either they're for the primary characters or secondary characters, but they all have an element. You think Aragorn, Arwen, and Harry and Ginny, and Ron, Hermione. Well, I don't know what happens.
Prince Caspian in his girly girl.
That thing.
Yeah. Love that for you. Prince Caspian was one of my first crushes. And then he got played by whatever that guy's name is.
From Shadow and Bone?
Ben Barnes. Oh! I'm glad that was unanimous. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, so there's always an element there. So I feel like there's 2 genres of readers. And I think the more common, just based on kind of what we're seeing on Book Talk and Bookstagram and all of those things, is people who are kind of new to reading and did not grow up reading or re-entering their reading phase are approaching it from a romance with fantasy. That's kind of their gateway drug. I want lots of romance, I want lots of spice, and I want a fantastical setting. And then we have traditional readers who kind of grew up reading these classic romantasy, literature kind of style writings, are I kind of like these romance elements. Tell me more about options with more of that. And so you're either coming at it with these 2 different angles, and we meet in the middle, and we have pure romantasy as the best balance of both.
As you're saying this, it occurs to me, I feel like that the two different trajectories into romantasy is why there's so many differences in opinion with smut and steam, where like some person could read a book and they'd be like, this is 5 little peppers, like this was so hot. And then maybe someone coming from like romance in a fantasy setting is like, honey buns, like that is so vanilla.
Let me introduce you to monster and mafia romance.
Yeah. But it's like it makes sense that we maybe can't come to a consensus on what counts as smutty and steamy and like to what degree. And
it might also account for our wildly differences in like reviews, like why some books are reviewed 5 stars and 1 star. Well, maybe some readers are coming out from I want more fantasy, while some other readers are coming out with I want more romance, and they're not getting that when they're reading a certain book, which is why we have such discrepancies in the rating systems.
Yeah. I will say, as we're talking about this too, that I think romantasy maybe needs to be a higher standard for like what counts as romantasy. Because when you were talking about how it has to be 50-50 and if you take away one half, it falls. I think there's a lot of books that people kind of claim as romantasy that maybe don't meet that criteria. And I feel like that's almost some of the books that aren't as good or like, you know, maybe are book talk famous, but then when you like really read it, you're like, what the fuck is this?
Or books that should be, you know, fantasy with romance or vice versa, but they don't lean too hard enough into their dominant genre. Like they don't do enough for the world or for the setting to like firmly place it in a fantasy genre, or they don't do enough for the romance development.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically for like that Daniel Jensen book that we read earlier.
Oh, the Mark and the something.
Yeah, A Fate Inked in Blood.
There we go.
That one. I feel like that leaned way, like it tried to be romantasy. It tried to do both, but it leaned into the romance too hard and too soon. It leaned into the fantasy very, very well. And I feel like if it had veered more towards fantasy rather than the romance and developed the romance over 3 books rather than the first book, might have been a better book.
Wow.
I don't think anyone could have saved that character, though.
No. Honestly, no. That is interesting because I do feel like that kind of encapsulates the issue with that book. That the fantasy was well developed. It was that one half, but then the romance half kind of fell flat. And it's like, this is kind of a garbage book. Interesting.
And then we look at a book that we also reviewed this year, The Winner's Curse trilogy.
Yeah.
Which we both agree is 50-50. That is pure romantasy. One does not exist without the other. That is the proper balance of romance and fantasy.
Yeah. And I feel like it struck that balance so well that it had to have been a good book because the romance was developed out in a meaningful, interesting way. The fantasy land made sense and it was like integral to the plot, and it kind of furthered the romance in a way too. Like they were intertwined really well. And I feel like that kind of speaks to like why it was so good was it figured out that 50-50 mix, beautiful, perfect proportions.
Yeah. Wow. So there are also these gateway drugs that are pure romantasy, but they do both so well that they manage to lure in both readerships.
Yeah.
So ACOTAR comes to mind. And I know there's a lot of ACOTAR haters out there. Like, we kind of have dabbled in the hate of ACOTAR as well as the love of ACOTAR. But it does balance both, like creating a world, creating this character, creating a love interest, and then developing both out into these very unpredictable trajectories.
I think, so you made a point when we were reviewing ACOTAR and ACOMAF that it almost reads as one book, but like part 1 and then part 2. And like they put it into 2 books because it's so long, but it really reads as one story. And I feel like that kind of speaks to the first half being more fantasy driven. And like, yeah, it does have romance between like her and Tamlin, but it doesn't take up as much brain space as it does in the second book. And I feel like that kind of explains how it falls so perfectly in romantasy.
That's also a really good example of a consistent pattern we've seen in books that we love and have a lot of mass appeal. So think of Crown Duel, which was originally published as 2 books, but now is 1 book.
Oh, that's true.
The Winner's Curse trilogy. We said right in the beginning, this reads like 1 book.
Yeah.
Because it's so well developed.
Holy shit. Oh my God, my brain is like exploding right now.
We have hacked the Matrix.
Oh my God. Wow. Because I think my beef with Throne of Glass, because I read those books like the first 4 or 5, and I fucking ate that shit up. I loved it. She was my favorite character in the world. But I think what happened is Sarah Maas started those series as purely fantasy with romance, because I feel like the world building was really well developed. Like you focused on Serena, whatever, as a character and like her troubles. And she had these like two people that she was like kind of having feelings for, et cetera, whatever. But then the other books towards the end, like I fell off and like I don't even think I've read the last
I
two.
did not read I steamrolled through the first 4 or 5 books.
Yeah. And I think it's because she got too caught up in how like well Akatar was doing that she's like, okay, let me just like lean into the romantasy. But it's like, no, the story is fantasy with romance. And I think if you get like caught up too much in trying to like move genres halfway through a story, like it falls off. Because like if you're starting in fantasy with romance, you should like end that storyline in fantasy with romance and not like try to, do too much.
So is romantasy an accident of good writing?
Blink, blink.
Because if you just do both so well, if as an author you know how to do character and character development and character interaction, and you overlay that with world building, plot, and setting, and you do that very well, then you create this exceptional genre of romantasy.
Yeah.
And so you either do one or the other, unless you are like next tier author level.
Yeah.
And then you create romantasy. So what you were saying earlier is the threshold for romantasy as a genre and entry into it needs to be higher. I think it's because of that.
Yeah. Because on the one hand, I agree, because I feel like you can't do both well enough to really be romantasy unless you are thinking about exactly how you want that 50-50 to kind of pan out. But I also will say that there's a lot of really well written fantasy with romance, but it's like its intent is different in the story. Like the romance is there and it's like an engaging part, but like the intent is like the hero's journey almost. Like the intent isn't that two characters get together. So maybe that's kind of like really the difference between fantasy with romance and romantasy is like, what's your end goal here? And maybe romantasy has both.
That's an interesting point. So romantasy as a genre has two end goals, which is plot conclusion and romantic relationship conclusion.
Yeah.
Both of those have to end by the end of the story or the series. Versus, fantasy with romance, you have to end the plot.
Yeah.
Whether you end the romance or not, or it just exists. Great.
Interesting.
Romance with fantasy, the relationship must end, but whatever's going on in the background in the world, someone else can solve it.
Yeah, because it immediately makes me think of Master of Crows by Grace Draven, where like you're never really sure like what's going on in the background and the whole like Leviathan thing. You're like, sure, I'm just along for the ride and like these smut scenes are great, but it's like that's basically romance with fantasy.
Or Bride, for that matter. Like, yes, you care about the war between the vampires and the werewolves, but like not so much that you need a second book to find out.
Yeah, I almost wonder if that's why the ending scene felt so rushed and like unnecessary, where like the bad guy explains everything that went wrong. It's like, I'm not really here for that.
I don't care. Like, we're obviously here for the relationship.
Yeah, so I almost wonder if she tried to just like leave it more kind of ambiguous and like, politics or whatever, it would have been better, because that last like 2 chapters of Bride are just a hot mess.
So maybe that's an example of Twilight and where Twilight fails. Twilight is obviously romance with fantasy, but it tries to lean a little bit more into the world building in books 2 and 3 and draw out the relationship a little bit more.
Whoa. God, I am like, we're crack. I bet there's readers in their car like, yeah, obviously, like these are the genres.
Why haven't you been thinking about this all along? Like, I realized this 10 years ago.
Yeah, but it's just so funny to me because I have also been lurking on the romantasy subreddit and I see these books recommended and it's like, I don't know that I would call that romantasy. Like, I get the intent behind it. I get it has maybe romantasy energy, but like the story itself isn't set up in a way that really like speaks to romantasy.
No.
It's like that's a very nuanced kind of actual characterization, romantasy.
I do need to do a call out to our romantasy subreddit because it is only thanks to the commentators on this subreddit that I actually read Reign and Ruin, because I downloaded Reign and Ruin
a long time ago,
4 months ago. And I started it. I'm like, this is kind of dry. It's kind of slow. And I put it away and I never revisited it. And then it came up again on another, like, well, if I want to read this, what should I read? And I'm like, everyone was like, Rain and Ruin, like Mages of the Wheel series. I'm like, what the fuck is up with this series? Like, it can't,
Who are these people?
Like, one, it cannot be that good.
Yeah.
And then I started reading. I slogged through the first like 30 to 50 pages because it is a bit of a slog in the beginning. But let me talk to you about our Lord and Savior. What's her name? J.D. Evans, I think, is the author of Mages of the Wheel series, Rain and Ruin. This woman has come to save the romantasy genre. Like, I cannot believe this author is Kindle Unlimited. She is Juliet Marillier, Grace Draven, and Marie Rakowski all into one. If you want spice, you got to work for it, but there's a lot of fucking spice.
I love that.
If you want world building, it's there. If you want a badass heroine who knows her shit and doesn't like give ground to anyone, it's there.
I wonder. So I haven't read it yet. It's the next one on my list that I'm reading, and like everybody's like, "Oh yeah, like I have a bunch of books that I'm going to read next." But this is actually the next one I'm going to leave here and start reading. Do you think that the beginning is so difficult because romantasy demands like the equal 50-50, but that's asking a lot of the reader to accept up front? Interesting.
Yeah, that's actually that's a good point because the author takes a lot of time to establish the world, establish the character's background and what her struggles are at the very start. And you have to do that if you're going to have equal parts fantasy and romance.
Yeah. I wonder if that turns off people who are used to romance with fantasy. Because you don't need all the like world building bullshit at the beginning because it's just to focus on romance. So I feel like that probably turns off a lot of people. But it's like you have to do that.
It makes the relationship more valuable as you read it because you understand the difficulties both of the characters experience.
Yeah. Interesting. My brain is entirely broken.
So
because ACOTAR, the full first like 2 chapters are world building. It's about her struggles, like her family. She didn't learn how to read, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder what makes that more palatable than J.D. Vance or gross. J.D. Evans.
So I'm not sure, but you know, we have a list of, we've kind of broken out the books we've reviewed and assigned them to one of these 3 categories. So looking at some of these fantasy with romance books, what comes to mind, you know, The Blue Sword, which is to come, readers. Ooh, there's a story behind that, but we'll get into it later. Graceling. So we didn't review the Lioness series, but Tamora Pierce's, you know, the Immortal series. Crown Duel, Sherwood Smith, you know, One Dark Window is probably the most recent fantasy with romance book that we've talked about.
Which, a little aside, I think so many people have difficulty getting into that one because they're expecting more of the romantasy 50-50, but that's definitely fantasy driven. There's all this stuff going on in the background and like a romance is developing and it's heavier in the second book. But it's like if you're hoping for just romance, it's like you gotta work for it way more.
So I think it kind of pays to read, you know, both of these subgenres, read them separately, and then once you meet and then once you get that happy medium, you're going to power through a romantasy book, that pure 50-50. Like you don't want to put it down because it's so well proportioned.
I feel like that kind of speaks to the ones that are good, it's well proportioned, because I mean we smashed through The Winter's Curse. We smashed through.
The minute you started talking about it as a pick of the week, I'm like, holy shit, I have like scenes embedded in my brain from that book.
Yeah. So it's like, you did your homework with the fantasy with romance where you're like, God, I need like a little bit more. And then you did your homework with the romance with fantasy where you're like, I don't really understand like what's happening in this world, but I love the relationship. And so you just like power through these really well done romantasies. But if you can't power through it, the ratio's off. I feel like that's the indicator.
Yeah. If the ratio is off, if it's 60-40, you know, fantasy to romance or vice versa, you're not, depending on the reader you are, you're not going to finish it. So if it's, you know, if it's dominant fantasy, maybe you're going to finish it if that's what you started out. If it's dominant romance,
Because it probably is what catches people off guard if there's too much smut, but they're like a fantasy with romance person foraying into romantasy, and then that romantasy book has a little bit too much smut. They're like, whoa, this is like erotica. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Sidebar. When I was at Half Price Books the other day, I was very impressed and very proud that they very clearly labeled an entire section as erotica. Because we talked about, the difference between erotica and romance and, all of these things. And Barnes & Noble's refusal to, like, have an erotica section.
Yeah.
Half Price Books, they're like, we know what you want. It's right here.
Here's the spicy dirty.
Discounted.
Nice. They know the struggles of women. Interesting. So, yeah, we talked about fantasy with romance. What about romance with fantasy?
Oh, my friend. This is my jam. Because I feel like I kind of lean more into romance and romance with fantasy.
Yeah, I think I'm more fantasy with romance. Interesting. That's why we have this podcast. We met with romantasy.
There we go. Okay, so romance with fantasy. What comes to mind right away? Bride, Ali Hazelwood, Master of Crows, Grace Draven. Frankly, anything by Grace Draven.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Is going to be romance with fantasy. Cruel Beauty, author.
Rosamund Hodge.
Okay.
It was something fancy sounding.
And then Divine Rivals comes to mind as well. Any other romance with fantasy that you can think of?
I don't read this as much. I think that's kind of why I can't immediately. No, because I feel like I was too, not nervous to read romance with fantasy, but
this from the woman who reads Hermione fan fiction.
See, that's why I went so hard into yeah. Because I feel like I was younger and I really focused on fantasy with romance, and then anything that had too much smut, I'm like, oh, can't read that. Gotta go back. Yeah. Because I don't really, these are my like, the ones you listed are the ones that I know for romance with fantasy.
So Robin McKinley has, we're going to get into Robin McKinley and her, like, the Blue Sword next week. But her book, Beauty, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, is, one could argue, could sit in romantasy, but I feel like kind of is romance with fantasy because it is purely an embrace of, Beauty and the Beast, which is the development of a relationship between Beauty and the Beast. But it's done so delicately and so
like nuanced.
It's not, this is going to sound bad for people who like romance with fantasy. It's not sleazy.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel that is kind of where fantasy with romance readers get turned off with the romance with fantasy is like, there's too much going on here. Is it going to be sleazy? Am I going to open, 20 pages in and there's going to be a sex scene? No, I would say. Like, this is not erotica with fantasy. This is romance with fantasy. There's a difference.
Interesting. Gosh. I feel like I had a point, something that you were talking about.
We were going to talk about the bridge stories, the ones that kind of sit in romantasy land. But
that brought up my point. Why do you think romantasy took so long to come into fruition? Like, why wasn't that an obvious thing for writers to try to, because I can't think of an older book that I would classify as like romantasy.
Yeah, it's either going to be fantasy with romance or romance with fantasy. There's no in between. I feel like that kind of aligns with women's rights and kind of that trajectory and women, I feel like women have always dominated writing as a profession. Maybe that's just me observing. This is not I am not a historian. I don't know what I'm talking about. Take that with a grain of salt. So in this instance, I feel like it's more like women's sexuality is more of a conversation now. And so maybe that is an aspect of this, which is romance is about that to some extent.
I almost wonder if it's kind of tied up in the whole, I feel like a bunch of incels are going to fight us, but the Lord of the Rings kind of like elitism almost, where fantasy can have romance in it, but it not in a way that like I think a lot of people would find satisfying. Like it's more like a sidebar. And so if authors wanted to write fantasy, like romance can't ever be anything more than a sidebar, or else it would be categorized as like romance or erotica or like women's fiction or whatever. So I do feel like it's like now that women's contributions are more overt and they get respect for what they're doing, that romantasy is allowed to be a thing where like you can have fantasy that's not as crazy giant as Lord of the Rings is and has all this lore, but you can still have a bunch of romance in it too, but it's still like good.
It doesn't
Books.
lessen the literary value of the book.
Yeah.
Writing. This kind of brings to mind. So this was going to be one of our Friday Hot and Bothered episodes.
Yeah.
But you found, was it on the subreddit?
The hate on romantasy?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was on Instagram.
Okay, so I don't know if you want to read it.
I do, because I want people to be equally as upset as I was when I read this comment.
Because, I believe this could be like a quick 5-minute Hot and Bothered episode, but I do believe it deserves more attention because, we're talking about what defines romantasy and does it qualify as a good book? And I feel so much hate whenever you...
Yeah. I was just minding my own business too. Like I probably had a titty out and I was like feeding my child and I just got angry. So the comment reads, I'm not going to say who it was because I hope they regret making this comment public to the world. But it also has 93 likes, so other people apparently feel the same way wrongly. Direct quote. Are we reading romantasy books now because they're good books? Like, do you mean good book is in a well-written, well-rounded, dynamic book, or like good for the genre? Because inherently, by design, most romantasy books are not good books. They are fun, fluffy books meant to be a good, cozy book afternoon.
Oh my God.
What the actual fuck?
Who are you to define what a good book is? A good book is different to every single reader.
Yeah.
You can, if you're... This is why I feel like social sciences kind of gets a bad rap because it's so subjective.
Yeah.
What someone finds as, oh, what a interesting insight into
foreshadowing symbolism.
Allegory. Weird.
Metaphor.
Words. But like... Who are you to define what good books are and what qualifies as a book and what doesn't?
Yeah.
Because frankly, what we're talking about, regardless of what genre you're writing in, whether it's romantasy or romance with fantasy or fantasy with romance or any other fucking genre of fiction, you are asking someone who has created something from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like they sat down at a computer or with a notebook and a pen and out of their own brains, they created something out of nothing.
Literally, though.
Like, what a magical experience. And how dare you lessen that by saying, does that even count as a good book?
Ugh, God. I get so triggered. But I feel like I think the point this person was trying to make is like kind of feeding into that whole,
elitism?
Yeah, because they're kind of downplaying romantasy as like, just like women's fiction. Like it's romance, it's fluffy, like it's just about the interactions between two people. But it's like with actual romantasy, there's a whole 50% of this book that is just world building. And like apparently that's not a high enough percentage for you to think it's like worthy of respect. Like, what?
How? Like, okay, so the next time, readers, someone asks you, what do you like to do in your free time? What is one of your hobbies? And you know that they know that you know,
yep.
or whatever of they knows that you like to read. And they ask you, what do you like to read? I don't want you to fucking say Pride and Prejudice.
I know.
No.
Or Lord of the Rings. I mean, you can enjoy
or
Lord
Harry
of the Rings.
Potter. No.
Yeah.
I want you to name off the most recent book that you read and say how amazing it was. Because some authors sat down and made that for readers.
Oh, I'm gonna cry. I'm not emotional. It's fine. Because yeah, you should be proud of the books that you're choosing to spend your time enjoying and like thinking about.
We have a whole podcast centered around reviewing books and whether they're good or bad and what we think. But what we think at the end of the day doesn't matter. If you like it, keep reading.
Yeah, honestly.
It's a book. Someone made it. Someone
Yeah.
created it out of nowhere. That's an accomplishment of itself.
Because I do feel like that's kind of a critique that some people make is like, why can't I just enjoy this for what it is? Like, why does it have to be literary or whatever? And I don't think any book ever has to be like that. Like, it doesn't have to have these, longer term symbolism and allegories, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it can just be a book, but we've said it before, there's just ways that you can make it slightly better and more enjoyable. Like, get closer to that, 50-50 mix if you're trying to be romantasy or to stick to just romance with fantasy.
And as a reader, I think as you're reviewing these books, as you're processing this whole genre, keep in mind these maybe 3 distinct variations within the romantasy genre. And maybe that helps, you process what you're reading better. So maybe you rate it slightly better depending with this knowledge.
Yeah.
I hope you had this knowledge already. I'm going to assume that you did.
I did not.
But I think that's something that I'm going to try to keep in mind when I pick up a book and I'm like, what is the intent of this author writing the story? Is it to deliver a relationship with a cool setting, or is it to deliver a plot with a minor relationship in the background?
Absolutely.
And maybe, 3 stars turns into 4 stars, turns into 5 stars.
And I think it'll help you make more informed recommendations to your friends too, because if you know they have a preference towards one of the 3 or 2 of the 3, you can maybe recommend books that they'll actually like versus ones that they're like, this is a lot of world building and I just want some smutty scenes. It's like, oh, okay, now I know you want.
I don't care about the formation of the sword gun Turin. Absolutely not. I want to know about the pony and the king and then how they kiss at the end.
Yep,
That's it.
I feel like you just encapsulates why that is fantasy with romance and not like romantasy. Because, we need a little bit more Corlath in our lives. Wow. My brain is like
I'm
pulsing.
sweaty.
I know. See, that's why it was supposed to be a hot and bothered episode, because we're both hot and bothered about this.
We just need more time than 5 minutes on a Friday.
Yeah. Well, because I feel like it kind of speaks to the foundation of this group of people that enjoy these books, that like this is a foundational tenet of what it means that we're talking about. Like, you can't really talk about that quickly.
No.
Especially when we're still kind of like building it in midair. Because, I mean, romantasy is like a newer term. Like, people don't really know it.
Only in the last, 5 to 10 years, I would say.
Which I still can't get over. Like, is there any old romantasy? Like, I cannot think of any. Like, I would trust you to know.
As we've defined it, 50-50, I don't know. I would say that probably Daughter of the Forest comes closest.
I could see that.
That was early 2000s.
Oh, wow. I always think that's like a 90s book for some reason.
Wasn't it? It's right behind you.
Oh.
Third shelf. So for you, dear readers, my dog ate the cover.
I was about to say, this is missing some things.
One of these books.
2000.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's pretty early.
It has older vibes, but I think that because it feels more like literary as a book. Wow. That's a good one. Read Daughter of the Forest.
Again, 24 years ago.
That is a long time. I don't like thinking about that. Never mind. No.
All right. So readers, whether you like romance with fantasy or fantasy with romance or romantasy 50-50, we're here for you. We're going to cover everything.
Yeah. And we will now moving forward tell you if it's going to be.
Now that we know. Figured it out. It took us, 2 years to do this, but
we did it though. We cracked the code.
Yeah.
Everybody at home is like, bruh.
We figured this out like
that's why Anyways, welcome to our I don't even know, epiphanies.
A journey.
Yeah, it has been a journey. On so many levels.
What are we doing?
Anyways, I love you guys. Marsha, yours.
I love you too.
Sorry.
We'll see you on the next page.
Hi, readers. If you'd like to help us pick our next book, send us a message on Instagram.
Or if you'd like to just listen, we post new episodes every Monday and Wednesday on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon. Thanks for listening.
Bussin'.